Perfect. So, right. So, who would be able to explain what pattern analysis is here in the audience? Okay, I changed a lot the responses. So that is good because today I am gonna give a pretty basic lecture about MVPA and RSA, and I hope that it will convey the key concepts that will allow you to think about these things and learn much more as you go along. So I go more to fundamentals than to detailed survey of the literature or things like that. If you have really pressing questions that you're really getting lost because of something, you can ask me. Some moment I might decide not to answer any longer, but in principle, I would like everybody to follow along because it's a basic lecture, and if you're not following, it is probably because of me. So let's get started then. Okay, so my goal today is to answer the questions that are listed here. So what is meant by MVPA in neuroscience? What kind of questions are addressed with the MVPA, neuroscientific questions, and key limitations of the method, of course. And the same will apply to RSA. What questions do we study with RSA, and what are the key limitations of that method too? I will point along the way some ways to mess up your MVPA and RSA analysis. And I will also end up pointing to some key challenges and future directions that might help improve the methods and address interesting questions. Now, to go forward, I will have to go back. I will review the concept of a massively univariate analysis that is used in MRI data, that Dan gave a lecture on this, and many people mentioned it, also Burak, along the way. So that's a good starting point to move to this topic. So what you see here, by the way, do you see my cursor?
Yeah.
Well, you see here, it's evidently a scanner. And immediately next to it, you see a representation of a fMRI activation map. So you see a brain, lateral view, and you see some orange, like indicating some activation, some voxels that respond. And what I'm trying to convey here with this figure is that I'm going to look at one single voxel, just one, that is somewhere there where I'm pointing with these lines. And that voxel is being modeled with a GLN, like you already know, that consists of regressors for two conditions, and then you get activity for each of these conditions, and then you can compare it and you can do other things. But this is just one voxel. So what? Once you fit your model, you run your experiment, you get a beta value of 1.2 for that voxel for the faces. And you get a beta of 3.2 for the places, which is exemplified by a house here. So then the question is, this voxel seems to like places, might be the conclusion, but we have to establish some significance of it. And normally, a univariate statistical test will be run. And here, for example, it reached significance, so this voxel prefers places. Now, exactly the same analysis can be done all over again in a second voxel, and a third voxel, and as many voxels as you like. In this case, I'm focusing a little bit within this yellow area here. That could be some region that you're interested in. So, although many thousands of voxels can be analyzed in this way, the point I'm trying to make here is that each of them is analyzed separately. And that's why this is a mass univariate analysis, because you do it many, many times, but separately for each voxel. Now, this approach has led to many findings, interesting findings, that have defined the field of cognitive neuroscience in the coming decades. And I'm indicating here a couple of films from the years of some of the discoveries, or when they were published. For example, Rafael Malach discovered the lateral occipital complex, an area that responds more to coherent objects than to their scrambled versions, which is shown here in red. In green, you see human empty area. The famous fusiform face area that Ken Wisher, McCarthy, and some people with PET had already seen under different names. And you have the hippocampal place area by Epstein and Canwisher. And also you have the extrastriate body area, Downing and colleagues. And there are more. The point is that this analysis strategy identifies areas that are active or differentially active for some experimental conditions. Now, from that point, we can say, now what is meant by MVPA? Well, this stands for multi-voxel pattern analysis. And what I'm trying to show here is like a spatial pattern of activation within this area. Each voxel responds with some specific amount, or perhaps deactivates a little bit, whatever. So if you go and put them all together now, this red box indicates that they're being considered as a set, as a whole lot. And they can be concatenated to form like a vector associated to one experimental condition. This is often called a pattern vector. Of course, you can do that for both of your conditions, and if you had more, you would do the same. And then you could apply some kind of multivariate statistical test and say, is this significant or not? But unlike univariate analysis, in MVPA, it's the brain patterns across many voxels that are jointly considered and what matters. Now, I put a little asterisk in the multivariate statistical test for a reason. I'm going to talk about that in a second, but for the time being, we could conclude that if the patterns differ significantly, then we have decoded information about the experimental conditions that, are represented in that set of boxes. And that is sort of important, can lead to kind of interpretations about what the area is doing, or how the brain kind of works or represents information. But as I just noted, in most papers, you're going to find that multivariate statistical tests are not really conducted or reported, even though they do exist. Especially, see all the original papers in this literature, to my knowledge, they all report coding accuracies and do something beyond that. Or perhaps just correlations, but usually accuracies. So why is that? I think this is an important issue to communicate. Well, one key reason for this is the curse of dimensionality. So this curse has to do with, there are difficulties that emerge when you have a small number of data points. So these pattern vectors that I showed, when you have few of these and you have a lot of dimensions, or for example, voxels, then it's very hard to estimate the underlying multivariate distributions. You need a lot of data. Now, this is related to the fact that the volume of a space increases very rapidly with dimension. We don't have good intuitions naturally about multidimensional spaces, but that's what happens. So the available data always becomes very sparse in high dimensional spaces. Therefore, the amount of data to obtain reliable results or estimate multivariate distributions grows exponentially or rough exponentially with a dimension. And that is a curse. But sophisticated machine learning techniques, about which Francisco already Pereira introduced a little bit. I don't have time to talk in detail, but for example, support vector machines, they perform pretty well with high dimensional data and few data points. They're not magical, but not far from it. They perform very well. So one might ask again, well, that's great, but what is a decoding accuracy? We have to start, walking before running. So decoding accuracies are obtained from some classification procedure. Okay. Here I show like the scheme how it's usually done. You have some training data. So these are many vectors for each of these conditions. This box, white box, is used to represent a model that will be trained. So this is the training stage. You have data, you train the model, and then you show the model or another pattern that it has not seen before. So that's the testing part. And the model assigns a class label to this pattern. Say, is it a face or is it a house? So that's the general flavor. But to explain this a little bit better, I sort of try to go into the white box and show a little bit what's happening there. The vectors that had 3 voxels are just going to show 2, make life simpler. And here you have a pattern vector for the faces and another one for the houses. And this point is the point in a 2D space representing that face. And here you have the red point. Well, it represents the place. Not too bad. 2 points. Of course, you have many instances of each class, then you have a lot of points. And this is like the activity in one voxel, and this is the activity level in the other voxel. And these little coordinates say where the baseline state was. So it's essentially what would happen if there is no response. Now, this is the model. In 2D, it's a line, but in higher dimensions, it would be a hyperplane. But we fit our model here. And now once we have that model, we can give it other patterns and, classify them into one of the 2 classes that it learned. The 2 big points here represent exactly that, 2 new stimuli. And yes, both patterns were correctly classified, which is great. Now, this procedure can be, and it's usually iterated several times, okay, with some kind of cross-validation scheme. And if the model is any good, the average decoding accuracy that you would get would be like about chance. In this case, it's a 2-class problem, like at 50%. Now, if you get a 50% value, you're going to be happy because you learned nothing. If you get 100%, you're going to be suspicious that you might have messed up your analysis. Not so great. But if you get like something like 82.1, I guess you're going to celebrate. So the key concept, the second key concept that I wanted to point out is why MVPA is here to stay, one might say. And this is because multivariate methods are sensitive to regularities in the data that are in principle undetectable for univariate methods. So this means they will never be able to see it. I think that's a pretty good reason. And this figure is from a paper by Cox and Savoy in 2003, and I really like it a lot. Here in the left, the same representation as I had before, but it just showed the distribution of the values here for that voxel. Same thing for the other voxel. And for each class, the red is, places. What you see is that this is a perfect case for a univariate analysis. Each of the voxels can separate the 2 classes really well. Well, that's great if you want to use a univariate analysis. But here, in this other case to the right, the distributions overlap. You cannot separate them well if you consider them separately. But if you consider them jointly, you can separate them very easily. And that is the kernel of the idea of why multivariate analysis are important and why you have to consider relationships among elements, not just the elements on their own. Okay, so now I can quickly move and talk a little bit about kind of very influential studies that put this way of thinking forward in the cognitive neuroscience world. This is a classic paper by Huxley in Science in 2001, and where this method and this term MVPA, I think, was actually coined. The concepts are older, of course, but they were applied in this field specifically to understand if object categories in the brain are represented by discrete modules, like I showed before, all these category selective areas. So now we're going to the neuroscience. He wanted to understand if perhaps we have just like one area, big area, where you have overlapping distributed patterns, no modules. You could, for example, have combinatorial codes and generate like an infinite or close to infinite number of object categories. How would you do if you need modules for each category? There are a lot of categories that might not fit in the brain. So this study showed a lot of objects and conducted analysis of distributed brain responses. I'm not going to go into the details of the method, but it's very similar in flavor to what I just described. They also report accuracies. And they concluded that you have distributed and overlapping representations of faces and objects in the ventrotemporal cortex, the area that is important in this case. They don't, their way of looking at the data does not fit with the idea of modules. So that is important. That changed a lot debate about these findings with univariate findings that came earlier. So I wanted to mention this paper. And then very soon came a paper, two different groups almost simultaneously published in Nature Neuroscience, where people could decode the orientation of a grading, like that one, in the visual cortex. And also in some variants of this experiment, they could do it from imagined gradings. So this was a very important finding and invigorated the field a lot, because voxels are too big to measure orientation columns. So this suggested that clever machine learning methods or statistical learning methods might be able to leverage information that was thought to be beyond the realm of fMRI. But this caused like a big stir. And moreover, if you can decode like imagined gradings or attended gradings, you might be able to read out a person's intentions or when they're lying. And this made a big spin into the realm of, at least in the media, a lot, into the concept of mind reading and how these machines might lead into that kind of work. Very influential paper. It's called Searchlight Analysis, coming from SFIM, and Nico Corte and Rani Goebel and Peter Bandettini. They started now trying to map the brain, not looking at just activations, but looking where you could decode information. So they call it information mapping. It's a different way of mapping, because the univariate effects might be zero in an area, but you might find information that separates the classes you're interested in, and that is useful. Okay? Another of the greatest hits is called cross-decoding. This is a figure from a paper from Evelyn Eger. Very nice paper. Early papers tend to be, in my view, the best. And she essentially wanted to see if a representation shown for like big chairs generalized when you show them little. That would tell that you're finding something that doesn't have to do just with the low-level features of the stimuli. And it goes to the issue of generalization. That's very important for categorization, and if we want to invariantly recognize an object regardless of many transformations like size, rotation, illumination, you name it. So that's the logic. Train big, test small. If the classifier works well, you have something that is tolerant to this transformation. Some people call it invariant. It's a little bit of, perhaps not the best word, but you get the concept. And a lot of us use this kind of approach to investigate other things, and I have some papers here as well. Now, some interim conclusions. We can say that MVPA can detect information that is invisible to univariate analysis methods. That is important, and I think it's uncontroversial. But MVPA, this is a downside in a way, does not tell us how information is encoded in the brain. That's also an important question. Not only that there is information, or you can find it, it is, how does the brain encode that information, if it is there? So MVPA does tell that information about our experimental conditions is present in the set of boxes under study. So that it can do. Okay, so now we change gears a little bit. So some key concepts of MVPA. I hope it is all clear until now. And now we're going to shift to a slightly different way, or perhaps not so slightly different way of thinking about patterns and their relationships. Okay? To do this, I will have to go back in history and remember where all these questions come from and these mathematical approaches and ways of thinking about data. So here you see a triangle where you have like psychology and philosophy at the top. You have computer vision and neuroscience. Huge progress in the last 100 years in all of them. And in all of them, the concept of similarities or similarity has played an important role. For example, in psychology and philosophy, there are debates related to connectionism and connectionist semantics, with this notion plays an important role. But also in psychophysics, you have Shepard in the 70s trying to find or understand invariances in representations, or how objects are rotated. If you rotate objects in your mind, how does that relate, to the real world, the world of three-dimensional objects? Are you like rotating like a real object? Questions of this type. And there, the notion of similarity was very important. Now, you have also computer vision, a lot of stuff happening in the 90s and 80s. I just put one example that I like, there are many more. But in computer vision, you had like networks that were learning things. Like in this case, they learning to recognize three-dimensional objects. Big thing, Nature paper. The notion of similarity, again, is very important there. And of course, now in neuroscience, but we're going to talk about that a little bit later. So now, when we go back to the question from the computer science point of view, we have people like Simon Edelman, who has a slogan which says, representation is representation of similarities. And he has an important question about how our representations relate to the world, and if they are veridical. I don't want to go into details, but this idea of second order isomorphism says, while the things are not exactly the same inside the head, the relationships among them might match the relationships among things in the world. And that is a way in which veridicality might be happening. And in neuroscience, of course, now we're getting back to our questions. You have the work of Tanaka in the 90s, where they found not only the shape selective areas and shape selective neurons that were found in the 70s, they found clusters of neurons with similar properties that were aggregated in space in something of order of 500 microns to a millimeter. So this is sort of interesting. If you have this kind of maps in IT that have to do with object properties that are larger, well, you could get this maybe with MVPA. This inspired a lot of interesting work, even from, and specifically from, Edelman himself, who did a very influential and not so often read study that I find fascinating and groundbreaking, which is called Towards a Direct Visualization of the Internal Shape Representation Space by fMRI. He already was thinking about this idea of spatial scale and the fact that properties that are relevant for the brain are or seem to be represented at a mesoscopic level. But he also was thinking of this notion of similarities about psychophysical spaces and the voxel spaces. So the space of the representations in the brain of these patterns of activation. So a very interesting notion. And here you see, for example, a classic figure where you see behavior and you see the brain. He analyzed like areas happening close to a low, that kind of area of the brain, not like early visual. And you see that with multidimensional scaling, they find solutions where you find some kind of mapping or structural similarities between these two, which is sort of cool because it's a relationship between the brain and the mind in a way. So now we go to the brain directly and to the representational similarities from the fMRI point of view. And each of these lines represents like a voxel, very similar to what we did before, just a little bit more, so it was a little bit different. And each of these dimensions is the activity in one of these voxels, and then for each image you show, you define a point in that high dimensional space. So that's what we have here. You can construct a matrix to represent the same information according to some distance measure. And what you see here is a distance matrix for each pair of these images. Same images in the diagonal, distance 0, because it's the same image. And then the value here, let's say that white is far, black is close, and intermediate things, they give you a certain configuration in this high dimensional space, which some people like to think of as a geometric object or a representation of geometry. That is the topic for a future presentation. In any way, you can give as input to MDS the patterns themselves, but also these matrices. So that's an important notion. But it's also important to note that these matrices will look different depending on what distance measure you use to construct them. Okay? Now we go to another classic inspiring this field of representational similarities, which is the work of Garrison Cottrell and Laxo, I think you pronounce the surname, where they looked directly into networks. And they wanted to see how to relate the networks that were different, to see if they represented the same information in a different way or in a different substrate. That's a really cool question because it's essentially saying what matters here is not exactly how many units you have in the network. It is how the information is structured in that network, and it can be the same regardless of differences. So the way they looked at it is by comparing these distance matrices, in the networks. So that was a very insightful idea and very influential, in the way to think about relationships between networks. But now, I can't even read my own note here. Essentially, yes, the intuition of representing, similarities as relationships between vectors. That's what this is about, because the activations across units of the network, just like activations in a voxel, also define a vector. And then you can look at relationships between these vectors and form a distance matrix, and the same thing you could do in another network. So that's the intuition here. And that's the same intuition I'm representing here. Perhaps it's not the best example, but it's not too bad in the sense that here you have only one unit in the hidden layer, and here you have two, but the distance matrices to a set of conditions, here faces rotated in depth, could look the same. And one might conclude that these areas are representing information in the same way. Okay? But you might find that they look pretty different, and you would reach the opposite conclusion. Okay? And now comes like the classic paper that put like the concept or the term representational similarity analysis in the neuroimaging world, which is the classic paper by Nico Krieger-Korte and colleagues, and also Peter Valentini and Marike Moore. But they now wanted to make a different use of this approach. I'm going to explain in detail a little bit later. I highlighted here in yellow a part that I don't remember by heart. It's a bit too small for me to read, but it says something about being able to abstract from the measurement process, to compare representations in a model or across species and across modalities. It says something about that you could just, if you don't know how to map them, perhaps you can just abstract from the measurement process, look at the dissimilarities, construct these matrices, and then just work by looking at these matrices. This idea is very powerful, but also some shortcomings, and I'm going to be talking about that a little bit. But this is the classic figure. So you see, you have computational models like the triangle that we put in the beginning, and then you have behavioral data from humans, and then you can have also like brain activity data from many different modalities like EEG, fMRI, self-recording, whatever. Now, the logic of RSA, representation similarity analysis, is that sometimes it's very hard to know how to relate things directly. You don't know how to map from, for example, electrophysiology to fMRI. So to circumvent that problem, when you don't know how to establish the correspondence directly, you can appeal to the matrix as a central hub. Okay, so you get a matrix from this technique and that technique, and then you can compare them. Or you can get the behavioral data, the brain data, get the matrices, and then you compare the matrices. Now, why do that? Because the matrices are indexed by condition, and the number of experimental conditions is the same for the behavior, from the brain data, for the computational model, you name it. So you start mapping things in function of the experimental conditions. Okay, so this just describes the same principle, but just these arrows there are pointing now, indicating that that's the central hub. And this was a very influential idea. It's a tremendously cited paper, and it's led to a lot of interesting findings. Some papers that I don't cite here, for example, but from paper from Nico from Neuron in 2008, and several more, later. It's a very active field of research, and a lot of people are using this method. But I think this is a little bit almost like magic, and it's perhaps too good to be true. That's what I want to represent with the little magic wand. And I want to give a feeling about why you might not want to go so fast. So here I'm showing you some matrices from real papers. So papers published in reputed journals like not long ago. And RSA, something I do not perhaps explain in sufficient detail, does not compare the full matrix. Very often it just looks at the lower triangle or the upper triangle, whatever, but it omits the diagonal. The logic is sort of like, well, things in the diagonal are not informative because they are relationships with themselves. So it should be 0 or something like that. But that is problematic. I will show you right now. And you will see here that this matrix that might look very pretty, it is sort of problematic because you have high correlations of some condition with something else than itself. And that's, you see, this is yellow here. That means that this condition, a minus 90-degree phase, in this case, these are phases rotated in depth. So this will be like the left profile and the right profile and the front view. It says that a phase like in 0 degrees, so a frontal phase is more similar to a 45-degree view to the left than that view is to itself. And that's sort of weird in a way. So that's gets you thinking, well, first, that can happen for many reasons. One of them is signal to noise issues. So if you have stronger signal for one condition than the other, you might find such things. But then, that means that whatever you find here is important to interpret what you have there in the off diagonal. That means it is not just a matter of looking at the lower triangle and you are kind of in a safe ground. Now, in addition to that, what I want to show here is that if you implement some transformations on your data that are quite usual, and they actually did in this case, which is subtract the mean cross conditions from each condition in a voxel before doing the analysis, these things can change completely. These distance matrices look and can look extremely different depending on if you mean centered in this or that way or not at all. And that's sort of important. It's a caveat that, you know, it needs to be considered. Sometimes it might not matter, but sometimes it might matter really a lot. And here I'm showing essentially the lower triangle, you know, where you're ignoring the diagonal. And what I'm trying to say with this representation here is that at the end of the day, depending on what you have here, this can mean completely different things about how the brain is structured or the responses in the brain to those conditions is structured. Does that make sense to everybody? Are you lost? This is an important point. Okay, that's good. Nobody's sleeping, that's great. Okay. So I got carried away. I already spoke about this. But now you can see that I'm essentially saying that these kind of profiles along the main diagonal of the matrix are very important to interpret the rest. And that this issue is a sort of a can of worms for this kind of analysis in some occasions. So signal to noise ratios or the amplitude of responses in different conditions and how they interact with data transformations and normalizations like mean subtraction, etc., something that deserves careful attention. Now, I don't want to go into the details because that would take a little bit too long perhaps, but what I want to show with this simulation, this is a simulation where I know the types of neurons that I put into the simulation, they all have unimodal tuning functions with a certain tuning width that like a certain rotational angle of a head. Okay, so let's think we have some heads and we have a bunch of neurons in the brain that like some orientation of the head, and that how narrow this thing is tells you how much they are selective for the specific orientation of the head. They might like a lot of orientations, or they might care a lot, or they might just fire to one. And this tells you how much neurons you have for each face orientation. For example, that means that you have the same for different orientations across the whole rotation. This means that you have a lot more for the back of the head than from the front, and this means that you have more for the front to the back. Now, all these neurons are unimodally tuned to a single preferred view, but the distance matrices look super different as a function of distance measure. And that's something that I wanted to explain, and also as a function of how many neurons like which orientation. So if you're interested in the form of tuning of those neurons, the choice of metric can lead you to very different conclusions. So if you choose an Euclidean distance measure or an angular distance measure, which is like the cosine distance, that's about the angle between two vectors, not how far their endpoints are. So that's an aspect of RSA I have worked on a lot, and I think it's very important. And again, if you use an angular measure, which is important to know, is it interacts in unexpected ways with the signal strength view conditions. Okay, so some papers there. This is a sort of a busy slide. It looks a little bit scary, so you can look at it later if you want. But the main point I want to convey with this is that here you have two vectors, just two, let's say two patterns, and they have a certain angle. And if you shift the center to this location, the angle changes completely. Now it's almost 180 degrees. And this represents that you shifted the origin to some other location. So it's just intuition, the flavor I want you to get, that you shift the origin, you change the angles. And how the angles change, well, depend on aspects of the representation you're studying. So that's something that is sort of deep. There's a certain self-reference in doing this kind of transformations that recenter the data based on the same data. Okay, so these are important references that have dealt with this kind of issues. And I go back now to the original image and I repeat the same idea, and I note here that using these matrices as a hub without considering further aspects of the measurement process, the choice of distances, it can be problematic, especially when you're comparing across species, but measurement techniques, and possibly also, when you look at computational models. And just to close to finalize, I wanted to read this citation, which is like from year 2002 from Shimon Edelman, which I find very inspiring. And it says, the most general approach to understanding the challenges facing perceptual systems is to cast them as problems in data analysis. An interesting idea. For theorists, the perspective immediately raises the question of the dimensionality of the data, which strongly influences the appropriate mathematical approaches to making sense of it. And I want you to leave you with this thought and think how that bears in your own experiments and in the questions you want to study. Final conclusions. As an icon, I just like to put this painting by Raphael, where you see Aristotle and Plato, who had radically different ways of thinking about philosophy. Plato thinking of ideal forms, abstractions. Aristotle, more like a biologist in many ways, and pointing to the ground. So it's a very diagnostic image about these two ways of facing things. And I'm a little bit on the Aristotelian side on this, by insisting in that considering the physical nature of your measurements is fundamental to understand how the brain represents and processes information. And you cannot just look at these matrices and these geometric objects, ignoring all these things. So, the study of representational similarities has a rich history in cognitive sciences, I have said. RSA allows you to establish some of these correspondences, but the recommendation to abstract from the measurement process is impractical. But these are the conclusions from RSA that I'm drawing. And incorporating information about signal-to-noise ratios and the measurement process can really help to mitigate these biases. That's something I'm pointing out. And the data demeaning across conditions in particular, it is not recommended, and that has been previously shown to lead to erroneous conclusions. And these are like the general conclusions, sorry for the repetition. So for MVPA, going backwards, well, this method can detect information that is invisible to univariate methods. They do not tell us how that information is encoded in the brain. They can tell us that information about our conditions is present in a set of boxes that we're investigating. And then these are very similar conclusions that I just said before for RSA. But I can say the positive things is that it can help to understand how information is encoded in the brain and to compare, in some instances, perhaps like models and, and data. And it can be a way forward when the correspondence problem is not solved. But the method's flexibility that you're getting by adopting this perspective comes at a cost, and that's what I want to also emphasize. Because the conclusions depend on data analysis choices, data recentering, choice of similarity, and how your measurement process influences how these properties look in matrices. And I would say, perhaps controversially, but I think not, but it's hard to argue with yourself. I think it is not generally advisable to abstract from the measurement process. And I think that model-guided approaches to RSA can help mitigate some of this method's limitations, as well as improve the interpretability of empirical findings. And thank you for your attention. And if you have questions, that will be great. Don't feel shy.
Go ahead,
Mhm.
John.
Are the questions in the chat? I don't know.
Yeah, we have a question online.
Okay.
Is it possible to perform MVPA for between group designs as well?
I'm not sure exactly what the person is referring to with between groups design, but if it's meaning across subjects analysis.
Yeah.
I have a paper on that is called like what do across subject analysis tell us about neural coding? And it is always possible to do an analysis. So the answer is yes, it is possible. You have your matrix, you can do whatever.
Hi.
Mhm.
Hi. Can you hear me? It's a question from me. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think yeah. Hi. Yeah.
Hi.
Great talk. Yeah. Yeah. Actually, this question is coming from our. There is a recent study from us that we have basically between subject design. We have 3 groups, and then we want to. Yeah, we perform MVPA actually already, but we do it within subject mean that we test whether there are 2 conditions within one group. For example, is pain. See whether the 2 condition is or classifier within this group. Then we want to say whether the difference the classifier we trained in pain. It's hard to describe because the other group, we basically didn't do the same pain manipulation. For example, is sugar. Yeah, we want to see whether we can directly compare train a classifier between the pain and the sugar. So it's not every subject to receive the pain and sugar. Yeah.
That is a difficult question. Now is it possible to address those kind of questions? I think it is. It depends in what prior information you have about how these things are represented. What is the relationship between these conditions? And if you can infer some kind of underlying topology or some underlying structure that would be possible to map across these 2 cases.
Mm-hmm.
So, but you would have to start to construct or think and elaborate models that would tell you about the nature of the latent structure that you think explains your responses. So it's a challenging question, but an interesting one, and definitely to attempt it. I would be happy to learn more about the details of your experiment because I didn't get all the details.
Okay.
If I understood you correctly, I think it's a big challenge, but it is a challenge is that it's a motivation to find a solution. And more than happy to chat more about it if you want to.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Yeah.
Any other questions in the chat or from within the room? Yes, please go ahead.
So when you're doing your MVPA, how do you choose the number of voxels to actually put into each vector? Or like, yeah, is every vector the same size? Do you start with some kind of parcellation and then break it down like that?
I like your smile, your cheeky smile, and I like the question. It's a good question. When you do things this way, the RSA way, you are indexing by condition. So you're relating things to the matrices, but within each of these persons, you have to decide what you put as the initial features, so the voxels or the channels or whatever. And that question is a delicate one. It is not easy to answer because that's where the thing sort of begins. It's deciding what is the area or the set of boxes that are actually relevant to consider. And there's work already in electrophysiology from Charles Gross and Goshin in the 90s. They have a very nice paper or book chapter that I can share with you that is called Population Coding and the Elephant. I really like that article, and it's thinking exactly about that problem. That if you want to do or study population codes, it is already a challenge to decide what neurons to consider. So your question is a good one. I wish I could give you an answer, but the way this thing begins, usually you give some kind of criterion that you hope other researchers will sort of accept and then take it from there. But it's always a valid question and worth thinking about what it means to select things that are relevant to be part of this representation. So the question is?
Yeah, I guess that was a big question. So I guess how does something like MVPA compare to something like hierarchical modeling, where, you know, you look at the brain as a whole, then you divide it up into regions of interest, and then if that region of interest is significantly different among conditions, then you start looking at like the voxels inside of that. I mean, I guess, you know, would something like hierarchical modeling in MVPA be able to detect different things, or? But I guess, yeah.
I think I get the flavor of your question. I think the hierarchical thinking is not necessarily incompatible with approaches to MVPA, but this idea of defining spatial scales or aggregates of voxels that make up a meaningful thing that you can look at, that is an open and a very interesting way of looking at brain activity. You know, and thinking hierarchically might be a reasonable thing to do. That's why I personally feel more compelled to take an explicit modeling approach, and then think about how these different scales can be simultaneously occurring, and different measurement techniques might be better to capture information relevant for the different scales or temporal scales. So I think if I answered your question, which I think I did, I think it's like it's an open, no, it's like a set of glasses that you have to choose with and choose from. And you can look at ways differently. And I think you should try things like that to go out of the box. And a lot of work can be done like intensively using computational resources to find partitions of the data and look if there are common motifs of similarity structure embedded in that. And that can tell you something. And things might look very different as a function of how far things are in the brain, or maybe it's not just distance, it's distance and something else, like for specific areas you're looking at. And that makes total sense, and it goes a little bit in the network direction that Josh is expert, I think. So maybe you can also talk to Josh. Thank you for the question. Any more questions that you? Go ahead. I like your skeptic questions.
I just want to understand better on the MVPA. Was a similar concept to object recognition, or if you, for example, instead of you structure similarity function, like in the image processing, when we compare it to images, was it a similar concept, or we had to do it like matrix voxel Y subject?
I think that is.
Wise, structure similarity and object recognition, or something like that, to apply on the same function,
I think that they're related things, but you can compare them one to one. What I'm trying to say is that MVPA, in this way that I showed it, usually looks at pairwise class separations. Of course, you could do it differently, but the main point is that it's a way of applying these machine learning techniques to brain data. That's sort of what makes it sort of MVPA. Multivariate pattern analysis, or originally was called multivoxel pattern analysis. But it's the same kind of question. It's about using machine learning methods to understand information encoded in these patterns. And images are also a form of pattern. So it's not incompatible. And actually, a lot of this work originates from the field of object recognition, like the paper by Huxley. It's about object recognition. Later work that has to do with invariances of object representations to rotations, translations, scaling, whatever. The idea of transformations and invariances in the recognition of objects is very, very deeply rooted in this whole MVPA literature. So your question makes an important connection, but I don't think they are incompatible or compatible. They're just like slightly different things. Thank you. Oh.
Okay.
Looks like we did it. Thank you.